Hello, today I would like to break a myth. No, the composer is not the legitimate interpreter of his or her music. Why? Well, since the transmission is the written text, not the interpretation of it. The interpretation is immaterial. The interpretation is in the connection of the soul of the performer, finding a kinship with this of the composer, perhaps the wrong kind, perhaps a different kind, but a genuine kind. The one that you're believable, where you talk through the piece as if it means to you, as it meant to the composer, but for a different way of expressing it. Doesn't have to do with time periods and war sonatas and Baroque music and different instruments, because all these things are good to contextualize. But I just speak here about the fact that when a composer gives birth to a piece, literally out of his inner or her inner world, be it a reminiscence, as I consider it to be it a complete innovation that in a way is visionary and obviously almost escapes the creator. I don't think the creator through whom this kind of dictation comes into mind to notate from a mysterious dimension, time zone, but it is concretized by writing it or notating it. And I think that, of course, in the first notation, the composer has to write the indications in words as well. Sort of like commenting what the music by itself already expresses, if not what's the point. But let's say if the interpretation is a layer over the composition, and in between the two you have the layer of the indications with words about the mood, the tempo, with or without metronome marking, this kind of hyphen between the composer and the performer, is it to have indications, as Ravel often does, double negation, to avoid something that you think as a composer the performers who would play would intuitively go into, and you want them to avoid it, like he writes, don't slow down. Well, you're not supposed to. But if the music brings you to, by the innuendo of itself, then perhaps it's counterintuitive. And of course, all music is at some point intuitive, like a native language. But for instance, most of the music of, let's say, non-Western European civilizations has been always transmitted by oral reasons, just singing, and the next generation sings it in turn. And of course, it evolves inevitably through the generations and the centuries, but it creates a musical identity, a cultural rather identity, where the music is more or less connected always to the lyrics, to the text, to the song, how you love, how you die, how you fear, how you hope. And all these songs are also either how to put asleep a child or how to rejoice of some victory or marriage or happiness. At the very level of the village life or of the tribe life, music, rhythm, pulse is the soundtrack of their lives. So it's music with a specific purpose. But when the music is just an emanation of one's intellect, be it through education or just the intuition, and sometimes trying to find the right balance, like Ravel writing to Mademoiselle Boulanger after meeting in New York Gershwin, asking him for lessons for symphonic compositions. Already successful on Broadway, he writes to Mademoiselle Boulanger, and that proves what incredible subtlety and respect for non-classical music in terms of the notation of the traditional way of Western Europe, for jazz in this case, or other genres of music. He writes to Mademoiselle Boulanger, would you have the courage I don't have to teach him what he wishes, because if we give it or bring it to him, we might break his essence, his intuition, his jazz. Of course, Ravel introduced jazz in a more artificial way through his own innuendo of it as a slow movement of the violin sonata, and with piano, the blues. But that's not about that, because this is like adopting Spanish music style by non-Spanish composers, writing jazz when you're not African American. It's appropriating a musical heritage that's not yours, but which connects you meaningfully to it. And therefore I come to the interpreter of a composer's piece that is not per se rooted in some tradition, except in the imagination and the emotional outpour of the composer's expression of the experience of life, or the experience of hope, or the experience of a spiritual uplifting. Whatever it is, you connect or you don't connect as a performer. Either you play it because it's a core repertoire obligation, it's because a school says it, or because organizations consider it important, or because you want to explore some lesser performed composer who might have been famous before, forgotten since, or constantly ignored. Dupont, and others in the French, for instance, early 20th century or 19th century ending composers. So history chooses its winners and its famous ones. And but there are a plethora of other composers who lived. Of course, some of them in the classical Baroque era produced music more industrially handmade, so to say. Not that it's a contradiction in terms a little bit, but it was survival music for the necessity of bringing music to their employers. And therefore Haydn, Vivaldi, a perfect example of this, compared to a Schubert who wrote only out of his own necessity, but not even in the expectations to be played. So his motivation was not the one of Haydn because of the boss, or Bach because of the church, but this industrial quantity with quality and individuality and complexity and subtlety and emotion and reflection and chromaticisms and canonic instrumental or vocal combinations and text expression that either brings the vocal singers, obviously, to express these words in a way that they are distantiated or they are magnified. It's not just illustrating through music life or the text of a given book, be it the Bible. It is a way to inhabit with this, I don't like it, universal language, very personal language of each of the composers, which becomes personal to each of the performers. They disagree among themselves about how it's supposed to be played, especially when they become older with experience, and they teach and they say Beethoven tempo is this, you're not supposed to listen to that, this other performer is wrong, they don't have the informed knowledge. Even in the early music repertoire, composer performers, or even just reconstitutors of the old music, if I may say, this necessity of our century to be craving for authenticity through knowledge of practice, performing practices, through articles, through treatises like J.C. Bach's essay, like many. And so you end up by having this kind of museum quality brought alive, because in a way every music played becomes present during the ephemeral moment of its expression, regardless if it's on the right or wrong original intended instruments or intended acoustics or intended even concert venues, most of the music was read in salons with patrons who even contributed to playing in it. And so the concept of interpretation and projection to a whole was relatively not existing until the mid-19th century, with Liszt, who became sort of one of the first top, I could say, rock pop star of classical music. Didn't exist as a concept, but he did bring a show, as well as a performance of virtuosity, and he was a whole package. Paganini, nevertheless, did as well, and this gave birth to some kind of a 20th century separation of the composers from the performers, because nobody would question if Liszt rightfully played his piece or Chopin. And nobody asked Chopin in a salon to play them a Beethoven sonata, or I don't know, a Monteverdi transcription of some aria of an opera to which perhaps he never had even access and didn't even know about. And so perhaps if they knew so much about, they might have been self-censoring themselves by saying, hey, everything was written before me, why me? Which is sometimes what happens to composers today when they get over-educated in terms of the amount in comparison to the past, with the short expectations of life and the fierce necessity of survival of the day. They produced music, and some of the lesser known composers didn't produce lesser interesting music per se. Mademoiselle Boulanger didn't hierarchize the composers but the works. That is possible. You can say, well, this is more expediting through practical ways, with the accompaniment attributed to very smart pattern harmonizing rhythmicity and giving a pace to Alberti, and then so you could learn how to write very quickly with the toolbox, relatively, as Mademoiselle Boulanger would call it, useless, but at worst boring music. Okay, not every composer was invested every time with a divine inspiration, if you want to call it so. But Vivaldi, but Bach, but Liszt, but Scarlatti, those composers who wrote plethoric, Bach, didn't evolve much in his style, but nevertheless plethoric. Is it because they imitated what they learned from their quick copying of scores of others and just continued the tradition, like Bach with the fugues, which existed with Caspar Fischer before in E major in his own writing of the Ariadne Musicae? And Bach doesn't quote his name, but he does quote the fugue. So he didn't invent the fugue, but what did he do with it? He sublimed the idea that the voice leadings are an idealized society of well-behaved, equal partners, and the circle of fifths for the transport through the tonalities, and then bringing out the beauty of the subject, but highlighted by the contra subject. As Richter used to tell me, don't just bring out the subject, it would be a one-voice fugue, as we tend to do when we highlight the entrances. The true counterpoint is to follow the layers. So yes, and that was of course incredible achievement when you write up to 40 voice motet like Speminalium by Thales, or a 6 voice Ricercar by Bach, which today in virtuosity doesn't appear to impress an audience, unlike if you play very virtuosically loud, fast, and expressive with a big piano in a big hall. Does it mean that interpreters betray the composers by playing them in different socio-cultural organizations like concert halls, festivals, recording sessions, musicologically enhancing the knowledge, intuitively organizing a repertoire that says separate from the one of the niche of the searchers, the musicologists, the scholars, and then the virtuoso performers who play the pieces that you can fill up a hall according to an organizer who has to make balances meet the finances, without which, unless you have subsidies, it's a lost cause. Why? Because classical music calls for reflection, calls for the listener's participation by knowing about the piece. They wouldn't be curious to go other than, okay, occasionally because of a name that is better and more advertised than another for a performer, but that's not their weekly, daily, monthly, yearly going to concerts, operas, ballets, quartets, appreciating genres that they have no idea they would appreciate. They might think of it as mostly do that. It's boring ahead of time. It doesn't have lyrics, it's not a song. We know that. And then contemporary music, extratonal, post-tonal. But what I want to think here is that when a composer comes up with some music, it's relatively intemporal. Okay, he lives or she lives in a time where they didn't choose, in a country they didn't belong to, but they become connected to its culture through the language. Again, I connect always music of the sincerest extraction of the composer's own inner world, connected to what is the culture, which is the language, which connects you intimately to your ancestors through your parents, and therefore through the ear. So your culture is your hearing of your language. Would it be a rare language, a forgotten language, perhaps a dialect that is being politically abandoned or feared to be continued or banned, or something that becomes of course, inevitably an ideology. And so then the borderline between then patriotism and hating the opposite or the alterity, it becomes very thin. But inevitably you're caught into this ancestral hatreds between nations or between cultures. And when you visit museums, you don't see but artwork that in fact reflect the battles, the fights for possession, the revenges, the struggle of the people to liberate themselves from a colonial group of possessioning people. All this is true. The cruelty of generally human nature is unfortunately factual. All these conflicts since ever brought always widows and orphans and created the fertile, unfortunate grounds for next war. So that's why when they called Prokofiev 6, 7, and 8 the war sonatas, it's a good contextual I guess in university intellectuals statement, but by essence any piece composed in any time period, for instance, is a war piece, because there is unfortunately wars going on all the time, since all times, and religious or land owning or ideological, regardless. And of course, the reason for the notation that doesn't carry the interpretation in a composer's, the myth, as I said in the beginning of our meeting, is that I think the composer has a very limited view of the interpretation of the piece because he or she is too close to their creation. Not enough distance. Not enough, the piece hasn't started to travel in public presentations through audiences. Look, Schumann died in the mid-50s of the 19th century, and Clara, who was much younger, obviously survived him almost as long, until 1896, and she concertized enormously after his death as well, of course. And she always played his music, and so she brought his music for almost 4 decades after him on the road. And I think that these are the indications for the score of the published editions that should be the most meaningful, because she put the piece with the love for him and the respect for his genius as a composer, but she brought it on the world, to the world, through her teaching, performing, and I think that Schumann had a very limited, in fact, paradoxically, even if essential, connection to his piece, because of course you can have the composer write indications which appear to be unplayable, either too fast, either too slow, and in fact you have to trust with a grain of salt the indications of the composers for the tempi, because again they are fantasized tempi. They are imagined at the moment of the lava coming out from the inner, if it is volcano, of the inner world outer, and written or notated, what today's computers. The performer comes after or during, but not before. So you cannot go to the creative moment as a performer. You can follow the thought process, you can organize patterns, understanding how that led to the next. You can copy to understand it better than only through the finger patterns, but it's good to know at all levels, the hearing, the reading, the intellectual comparing and contrasting the differences of the patterns, and then putting it in your hands, and then bringing it to the audience, and then the audience's performance. Well, people like Rachmaninoff with his Corelli variations, playing it himself, he noticed how in different auditoriums, he wrote it himself, different people reacted differently to different variations, and sometimes he would even cut short some variations a la carte, so to say, on the spot. Of course, he's the composer, so he has the right. We don't edit the piece. We serve it, we love it, we believe in it. We want to be believed in as a character that we play, because it means to us for the universality of the story that it carries, and is storytelling through the details of itself. Will it be a sonata like Waldstein, or somebody, a transcription of a symphony, or something from organ? I find that the composer's notation is in fact has not benefited from being on the road. It's the performers, in fact, who make the piece. And they make it because they bring it, and then of course then performers compare performances, and then you can have this with recordings, which wasn't the case in the 19th century. You can have this accumulated layer that the interpretation is a secondary comment or commentary on the creation of the piece. And I believe therefore that the best performers are not the composers, even if they can. The virtuosos like Liszt, Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Mettner, Scriabin, or the others who are more conceptual, who write for piano, but through thinking of a quartet, an orchestra, a ballet, name it, like Tchaikovsky and Beethoven and Schubert. And so you realize the pianism is not the same, obviously. The texture, the context, the way the piano is brought to sound as an instrument, by itself orchestral, or by itself oral or vocal storytelling, or just some kind of prayer for... It doesn't need lyrics to express what it touches psychologically directly in our own lives, like our own lives soundtrack, as it was the emotions that were vehicled, or the reflections that were vehicled through the composer's output on the music, with the notations of the pitches and the rhythms, and the breathing, and a certain rhythmic ritenuto more than the indication. If they do eighth notes, rest, quarter notes, rest, half notes. Yes, we have to be very respectful, and we are. We have to be also creative and say, but I really like it better like this, because the innuendo is not indicated. If you have a crescendo piano, does it mean it's a subito piano, or you go into it from pianissimo, or beyond it, mezzo forte perhaps, and then drop pianissimo? Then you overstate it, but it's effective. Does it mean it's right? Perhaps on the spot, intuitively you do it because you want to seduce an audience through the piece which represents you, or you represent it. And so I don't think, and I was very lucky to have heard my music played by people with whom I had not worked, or was not allowed to work as my doctoral student Sujin Ju was forbidden to study my music with me for conflict of interest in my university because I was the composer and her teacher. Okay, this is silly administrative rules, but apparently should be right because you have to accept the rule. Lex sed lex, dura lex. So we did, and she learned it on her own. When she presented 4 styles of my composition output for piano in a lecture recital, and I went to the concert and discovered what it meant to her, and it touched me. That another human who I didn't dictate to how to play it because I wasn't there to indicate the interpretation, just the score. It came alive. And I don't care if it was different from my opinion of how it should have been played, because I find that it was so believable, so meaningful to her that day in that performance, that I listened to it as a listener, not as the composer, with a distance, feeling that if what I left after me on the notation can mean something meaningful and touching to another human being on earth, this is beyond the gift. It's an intense experience of being human. For the rarity and preciousness and vulnerability of human lives, intensity, unpredictability of length, meaning of purpose, identifying to a past from which you don't know why you come from, but you identify and you become part of a culture. It translates you in hyphen between elements, and then somehow some people choose a piece that becomes universally important, and I would be lucky if that happens to some of my music, but I'm already very moved when I hear a recording of my piece played by people who didn't study with me about it, and that means to them so much. And when I hear it, I'm moved. It's not because I'm pleased that I'm played. It's not about that. It's beyond that. It's that I am understood through the notes. And therefore, as a teacher for dead composers, but also living composers whom I premiered, like Yukio Bayashi and Nicolas Bacri and Jean Francais and Dutilleux, and I was working with the living composers, being picky and demanding as they should be, some less, some more, and I tell them, leave me alone because I love your piece and you stress me. It's the rapport between the premiere of the composer's work and the composer's presence. It's something very, it's to do with shyness probably. Because you take a little bit of liberty. And this liberty is necessary, that the composer should accept that the performer is not a composer, but the performers, they take the piece in their hand, literally, and they carry it to the audience. So this hyphen between your inner world and the audience, they bring alive with their own meaning. And I'm just thinking that this is the best. Thank you.